and welcome back to my channel, Mental Health with Melissa. If you're new here, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more content as I post new videos every single Sunday and Wednesday. Subscribing to my channel really helps me get mental health information out there to our communities of color and tons of free LCSW test prep. I have hundreds of LCSW test prep videos with LCSW test prep vignette questions on my channel, and now I have a social work study with Melissa LCSW test prep program, tutoring guide, if you will, that is listed in the description box below if you're interested in that. So please go ahead and visit that. I am a therapist, an LCSW clinical supervisor, and a PhD psychology research student. Today we're going to go ahead and get into a new series I want to introduce, and it is called the Is It This or That diagnosis series. And we're going to start off by looking at some diagnoses in the DSM, two diagnoses per video that sometimes are used interchangeably by mistake or are confused as being very similar. And so we're going to start off with the two diagnoses today. And those diagnoses are adjustment disorder and acute stress disorder. So the way that these videos are going to work are that I'm going to go over one disorder or diagnosis at a time, and then we're going to compare and contrast after we've gotten a chance to look through each of the diagnoses separately, because it can be, again, very confusing when two or more diagnoses have similar criteria and are used interchangeably incorrectly by whether they be lay staff or even those that are mental health providers and are able to diagnose. So today, adjustment disorder and acute stress disorder are the two diagnoses we're going to look into. I really wanted to start with something that included adjustment disorder, because adjustment disorder is just one of the lesser spoken about and known about sorts of diagnoses in the DSM-5. I find that sometimes people can be misdiagnosed with whether it be generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder, when there's just a major change or shift that's going on in that person's life, and they don't necessarily meet the timeline criteria for MDD or for GAD. And a lot of the time, it may be adjustment disorder. And this is a really big discrepancy and something that we need to learn more about, because change and adjustment happens, and understanding what the differences are between all of these different diagnoses helps us become better clinicians and identifying what some of the criteria and the symptomology is with our clients. So let's go ahead and get started with taking a deeper dive into adjustment disorder. So adjustment disorder, and this information can be found on the web. I have a link here, the web URL, so that you can take a look at it if you wanted to print out some material. So, or you're more than welcome to screenshot this as well. So I'm not going to read this line by line and verbatim because there's so much information here, but rather you can take a look at it, and I'm going to talk while you're taking a look at it. So the diagnosis of adjustment disorder really comes from somebody that is experiencing some sort of emotional or behavioral health reaction or symptoms that are within a 3-month stressor that has happened in somebody's life. So this stress means that it's a lot more stronger of a stress than typically or normally would be expected in that individual's response. And this is causing significant changes and problems in relationship dynamics at work or at school. And we need to know too that these symptoms are not the result of any other mental health disorder or part of normal grieving. So an example of this may be somebody that has moved states. Say there is a 25-year-old female that recently was accepted into a university in Minnesota and has spent her entire life in the state of Iowa. And so she moves to Minnesota, And during that first and second month, she really notices that she's had difficulty sleeping. She's changed her diet because she doesn't really have an appetite. Her family has been reaching out to her, and she is really emotional talking to them on the phone, wants to change her relationship with them in terms of needing to talk to them like several hours a day, as opposed to before when she was more independent and didn't really rely on these relationships as much when she lived in the same state as them. Um, and her schooling has been affected ultimately. So that is an example of an adjustment disorder. Now, I want to get into the reason why adjustment disorder can be a little bit more complex too, and why people may not talk about it as much, is because um, adjustment disorder is actually even an umbrella term. There are 6 different types of adjustment disorders that are listed in the DSM-5. And so I want to go over each of them, and I will read these ones. So, adjustment disorder with depressed mood is when the symptoms include feeling sad, tearful, hopeless, and experiencing a lack of pleasure in things that someone used to enjoy. So, again, this can sometimes get confused with major depressive disorder or any sort of the mood disorders. But again, we want to really think about that change in a major part of somebody's life, and then seeing the mood being affected. Adjustment disorder with anxiety, that looks similar to GAD because it includes these anxiety symptoms of nervousness, worry, difficulty concentrating. Children who have adjustment disorder with anxiety may strongly fear being separated from their parents and loved ones. So that's something to keep in mind, because you may think of a child that who maybe has, we'll use the example of moving again, who has recently moved to a different elementary school, and they may have this fear and this anxiety that there's this huge change, and that means that they're going to be separated now from their friends that they made in their other elementary school. Adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood is exactly what it sounds like. So, kind of both of those things that we already talked about, except both with the mood and with the anxiety. Disturbance of conduct symptoms involve behavioral problems such as fighting or reckless driving. Children may skip school or vandalize property. This is one that I haven't seen that much, but something that's definitely still to be identified and looked at. Adjustment disorder with mixed disturbance of emotions and conduct. So symptoms include a mix of what we talked about, depression and anxiety, as well as the behavioral problems. And then lastly, adjustment disorder unspecified, which this is kind of similar to anxiety disorder unspecified, in which symptoms don't fit other types of adjustment disorders, but often include physical problems, problems with family or friends, or work or school problems. So, for example, with anxiety disorder unspecified, that means that it doesn't meet all of the same criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. And so we use unspecified anxiety disorder to replace that. So the same thing can be said with adjustment disorder. So if you meet with somebody that has had that major change in that 3-month period, and they don't meet any of the criteria that we just went over, any of these other categories of adjustment disorder, then it would be adjustment disorder unspecified. So you can see here that there's the kind of length of symptoms. So usually they're going to last 6 months or less. Things usually get better when the stressor is removed, or there's been a gradual transition into things. Signs and symptoms last more than 6 months are known as the persistent and chronic ones. They can continue to disrupt life, but typically we don't really see them that last that long. It's usually within that 6-month period. And so now we're going to go ahead and get into acute stress disorder, also known as ASD. So the DSM-5 describes acute stress disorder as the development of specific fear behaviors that last from 3 days to 1 month after a traumatic event. The symptoms always occur after the patient has experienced or witnessed death or threat of death, serious injury, or sexual assault. So we may know the differences between PTSD and ASD in that it's mainly a timeline. So with PTSD, that really comes into play after the 1 month, right? Like the ASD is really just with up to that 1 month. Anything that's longer than that, it's no longer classified as the ASD. So adjustment disorder doesn't necessarily involve that traumatic event. It can, but not always. It can just be another transition or a change in life, whereas ASD requires an actual traumatic event. So, um, I know ASD was a shorter sort of explanation and description, but I really wanted to focus more on the different types of adjustment disorders. But those are the main differences. So let me read the this verbiage here more, describing the differences. So people affected by adjustment disorder may present symptoms similar to those of people affected by acute stress disorder. However, a major difference between ASD and adjustment disorder is related to the trigger of the condition. Whereas ASD is caused by a person experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event such as a car crash, natural disaster, or sexual assault, adjustment disorder is triggered by a more broadly stressful life-changing event or circumstance, such as the birth of a child, job loss, diagnosis with serious illness, marriage, or the breakdown of a relationship. In addition, the reaction of the body's nervous system tends to be less severe than in ASD. People affected by adjustment disorder typically recover within 6 months of no longer being exposed to the stressor. So again, we kind of are seeing that those are the main differences. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that information was helpful to you. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below. Until next time, managing mental health matters.